Hello and welcome. We are pleased that you have joined us for today's webinar, Strategies for Building Meaningful Relationships with Youth. This webinar is hosted by the National Partnership for Juvenile Services and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. My name is Michael Jones. I'm the Managing Director for the National Partnership for Juvenile Services. Partnership is a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving all professionals across the juvenile services continuum and ensuring positive outcomes for at-risk and delinquent youth and their families. We are very pleased to have you with us for what will be an excellent and an informative presentation. However, before we begin, we need to address a few housekeeping matters. First, this webinar is meant to be interactive, and we encourage everyone to submit questions through the chat function on your screen. Following the panelists' presentations, we will have a question and answer period, during which time we will address as many of your questions as possible. You may submit questions at any time during the broadcast. Second, at the conclusion of the webinar, we would appreciate it if you would complete a survey on the presentation. The survey will pop up automatically when you exit the program. Having your feedback is vitally important to us as we plan for future webinars and training. Now, staff with the National Training and Technical Assistance Center will go over some technical aspects of today's presentation.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of OJJDP, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Callie Murray, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a few minutes to discuss a couple features of Adobe Connect, which will help you maximize your opportunity to participate in today's webinar. To download a copy of the PowerPoint slides, along with the presenter bios and photos, locate the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file, then click the download button to save the file to your computer. To send a chat message, type your message into the text box. Hit enter or click the message bubble icon to send. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. This will help us with our final count. Again, if you're reviewing with a larger group, please type in the number of additional people joining you today. If you're reviewing by yourself, there is no need to type anything at this time. Finally, this event will be archived in OJJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. You can also check out past webinars by NPJS that have been archived on the online university. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it back over to Michael.
Most of us are familiar with the saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. This saying is especially true for young people in crisis. If we want young people to listen to and value what we have to offer, we must first build relationships with them. Healthy, meaningful relationships with youth add to our capacity to maintain safety and security of youth and staff, and can improve youth outcomes both while the youth are in our programs and after they leave our care. We're going to open the webinar today by giving everyone the opportunity to hear from Hassan Davis. As one of the nation's most passionate youth advocates, Hassan travels the country speaking to youth and professional organizations and consulting with human service agencies. Many of you have probably already heard Hassan speak and are eager to do so again. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Hassan Davis.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad you're joining us today for this webinar. My name is Hassan Davis, and the first thing I want you to know is that I consider myself a hope dealer. And I hope that after we're done here today, you will understand and believe that you're part of that same team. I believe that every child deserves to be engaged, empowered, and provided a clear path to their own personal greatness in education, career, and community life. But what we know, and especially you who do this work every day, that the challenges most of these young people that we see are in crisis, and we have to figure out how we move them to their better place. I had the pleasure for 6 years to serve in the executive leadership team of the Kentucky Department of Juvenile Justice, and I'm so glad to see so many of my colleagues and friends joining us today on this webinar. In that role, I had the opportunity to really begin to refine the work I've done over the last 20 years in youth services. And when we think about this work in particular, developing meaningful relationships, I think it's important that we really focus and are clear that we're talking about developmental relationships, that when we talk about this over the next hour and a half, we're talking about those meaningful relationships that actually move young people from where they are to where we imagine their better place is. And so for us, it's important to keep that in mind because it's very intentional work. And you'll hear as we go through this webinar the idea that this is what we do intentionally to make sure that young people have the tools to be better off having encountered us, not worse because of it. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we move through this process this afternoon. I entered the school-to-prison pipeline at the age of 7 years old. As a young person with dyslexia and ADHD and severe visual impairment and hearing problems, I started first grade already behind the ball. What those teachers didn't know, especially at that time, was that I was a different kind of learner. And even with all of those other things, they didn't realize that I'd also just experienced the divorce of my family, witnessed my father attack my mother, and started to experience home insecurity. And so by the time I reached elementary school, there were lots of challenges coming up. And many of you know my story and understand that the reason I tell it is because we who do this work have to understand that there's a process to really moving us toward the success we do with young people. And so and a lot of us have these experiences also. But after lots of challenges in elementary school, lots of home security, the loss of liberty, the loss of home, the loss of community, I eventually wound up in alternative school, and after being expelled from even alternative school, I got my GED and moved on. Now, the reason I want you to know that is because that is the lens that many of us see the young people we deal with every day through. All of these challenges that seem to pop up, and there's sometimes the question in our head, how do we even begin to connect with a young person who has been through so much trauma, drama, and pain that we don't even know where to start? And so the conversation that we're going to have is predicated on what happens after you understand. And so first, we have to get right with the idea that in order to have a relationship, to be in a relationship with young people in a way that is developmentally positive, that provides them a chance to move forward, we have to recognize them in place, where they are. It's great for us to know some of those young people who just get it right the first time, but most of us in this work understand that young people who come to us in crisis, and we have to figure out how to meet them at that crisis point and then lead them forward. As I moved through my childhood delinquency, juvenile arrest record, expulsion from schools, and removal from classrooms, I had a number of people in my life who continue to be that constant. And I think that is the piece we're going to continue to call on today. Your role as a constant, as a North Star for some young people in order to give them the opportunity to imagine themselves different. And why we build relationships. These relationships building between youth and adults is one of the most critical factors in healthy development. We know this. The reports that we have about youth care workers, youth workers, probation officers, teachers even, all those folks who engage with young people on a regular basis show across all the indicators that there's a greater satisfaction level with those employees, not just with the outcomes for young people, but with that staff who actually have and to build developmental, meaningful relationships with the young people. In fact, there's an analogy that I can share with you right now with the Kentucky Department of Juvenile Justice. Back when I was commissioner, we had one class of youth care workers that came through our academy at a very high crisis point. We had 60 new workers that we had engaged and really empowered to go out and do the work of the agency, making children better, having touched us, not worse. And within 1 year, all but one of that 60-member class had left the Department of Juvenile Justice. Now, there was lots of discussion about how and why those might be, but the thing that I did was travel to the far western part of the state and meet with that one youth worker who stayed. And what she said was that she was there because she had had the ability to develop strong relationships, and she could see the impact that her presence was having on the trajectory of a child. Now, in that environment, it was clear that she had found her mission and her passion and was focused on her outcome. But there were so many in the system who got tired of the idea that their best work was to hold young people in stasis and in fear of their worst moment, their worst choice to life at that date. And so in our systems, we have to find a way to really engage ourselves in believing that we're making young people better, because if you only believe your best work is to punish them, which I've heard a lot across the country as I've worked with agencies and programs, if you think that your job is to remind the child of their worst day, that can burn you out as fast as anything else. And so we have to get the lens right that we're looking through in order for us to really have the ability to have impact with the young people we serve. Respect is a huge, critical part of the component of successful relationship. The 3R principle, respect plus relevance equals good relationship. Respect in the work that we do, very often we find ourselves demanding respect and having the old adage, you're going to respect my authority. And what we have to understand, and what I hope we can continue to understand, is that young people in crisis are the last folks that rely on authority as the thing that draws their attention and keeps them compliant. And so what we know, again, from the research is that relationship actually creates a stronger authority relationship. It provides us something to actually draw on, and being relevant, understanding what young people are going through, understanding them culturally, socially, and emotionally. All those tools together provide us a lens to look through that allows us to really build and connect with them, like I said, not just randomly, hoping to have some connection, but with very intentional processes, because every day our focus should be moving a child closer to their better place. How do we get them out of secure detention? How do we get them out of placement? How do we get them off of probation? And we use our relationship as leverage to move them believing, as you heard Michael say before, that we care enough about them, that we want them to change and have a better life so that they can actually opt into the process with us. And Maya Angelou once said that I did then what I knew how to do, and now that I know better, I do better. I think about this quote often when it comes to child-serving systems, because there are lots of updates that we've had to have over the last few years. What we know about command and control environments, which are generally the systems that encounter young people in crisis, is that they are useful in short-term management and maintenance of young people in very strict quarters, but they're based on intimidation, and they're based on power struggles that we know very often go south. They don't create safer environments, they don't build respect for authority, and they limit the possibility of actually creating relationships. And so in the last couple of years, what many of you, I'm sure, have noticed, and what I've noticed as I've visited with you across the nation, is that we are finally starting to shift our focus from this command and control setting that was the clear choice 20 years ago when we had the super predator fear and everyone told us that we had to batten down the hatches and hold those poor, those bad kids accountable. What we know now is that we have to engage them differently, and when we do that, and I've seen it in Kentucky juvenile justice, when we started to shift our lens and focus on the young person, the family, and the community as a whole, and trying to build relationship, things start to get better. And in Kentucky, in the work that we're doing, it's clear that things are getting better, and so many places around the country. And so we have to really consciously shift from this command and control process to a much more intentional and engaging process of building individuals. Youth care workers have the ability to increase a young person's readiness for the rest of their lives, or to derail them completely. I think that's the thing we always have to keep in mind. The authority and the power that we wield in this position gives us the ability to really move young people, but we have to actually take the responsibility to do that in some positive way, because otherwise, by default, we can be doing more harm than good. In this section, I want to finish with just a nod to social-emotional learning. It is, in my sense, a process that allows us to get to the work that we're doing, whether we are probation officers, community workers, youth care workers in a facility, educators, after-school program workers. When we start to actually develop social-emotional learning tools, which connect with positive youth development tools, it gives us a chance to bring young people into the conversation. Too often, the thing that happens in the work that we do is that we're doing work for young people instead of with young people. And this generation in particular, probably more than any generation before, wants to be engaged at a different level. In order for us to reach them, we have to understand them better, find out what is driving them, figure out where their motivation is, build empathy, help them manage relationships. So the social-emotional learning framework, which I just put here as a placeholder, and I hope that you have the chance to go and look a little deeper, provides us lots of information. In fact, there's a webinar next week, and I'll see if I can post it by the end of this webinar about social-emotional learning that might be beneficial. But it is a great framework for the conversation of how we engage young people developmentally in building relationships. I'm going to leave that slide there for a second, and I'm going to take my time here. I know I'll be back at the end, and so I look forward to speaking to you again shortly, and I'll turn over my time, Michael.
Thank you, Hassan. Our next presenter is Dr. Rodney Irwin. Dr. Irwin is a child and adolescent psychiatrist in clinical practice at Kaiser Permanente in Northern California. Throughout his career, Dr. Irwin has had a desire to work with and advocate for children and adolescents, as well as adults with exposure to trauma. He has worked as a psychiatrist in adult and juvenile detention facilities and as a psychiatric consultant to a residential treatment center for children with severe emotional disorders, usually related to trauma or neglect. Dr. Irwin, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I wanted to offer also my thanks to Hassan for his work and inspiration to us all. And as I see people signing into the webinar, I'm also inspired to see all the many people from across the country, from many different places and many different settings, who are committed to developing relationships with youth and with each other. And Hassan said he was a hope dealer, and I think we're all buying that. Today I certainly am, because it's inspiring a lot of hope in me to see so many people involved in this webinar. So thank you very much. As I was preparing what I'm going to say today, I was looking for some photos to put up on my slides, and so I Googled building relationships, and this is a photo on this first slide that came up. It's a photo I've seen many, many times before, and one that I've always loved just because it's just such a cool photo, and I love the drama of it, and wonder sort of, I'd love to know more about how this photo happened. But I also wanted to use it because I really feel like it embodies what building meaningful relationships means in many ways. First of all, relationships are risky. There aren't any certain outcomes when you invest in a relationship, and you really have to make yourself vulnerable to develop any kind of relationship with anyone, especially with youth. It takes a lot of hard work. You can see that these men on this theme have been working hard. But as I said, I think that this photo probably came out of a dare or a desire to have some fun and do something together on a break from their work. And so I really feel like relationships are enjoyable and meaningful and are something that you do together to accomplish something, even if it's just to have fun. Finally, I know it's probably hard to see on this photo, but the last thing I want to say about this is that relationships, as Hassan mentioned, can either be for good or for negative. And the two men on the left, on the end, I notice one of them is lighting the cigarette of another, which I think embodies the idea of someone mentoring a negative behavior in a relationship and having a negative influence. However, the two men sitting next to them, I know you can't see this in the photo, but the man is holding a piece of paper. It's a newspaper, and on the cover it says vote. And I imagine that they're talking about politics and about meaningful issues. And I'm imagining that the one man is talking about how important it is to engage in his community and to vote and to be a part of his society. So I think it's just a great image of how different relationships can be and how meaningful they can be. in terms of moving forward with my talk, I decided I wanted to break things down into the various words in the title of our webinar. Beginning with youth, what is meaningful, what does it mean to build relationships, and finally focusing on some very concrete strategies to do that. So if you're going to have a relationship with someone, it's obviously important to know something about who they are and what you're getting into. So I want all of us right now just to think about, when you think about developing a meaningful relationship with a particular youth, just think about what images are coming to mind right now. Think about how you are in that relationship, and also think about a particular youth that you'd like to develop a relationship with. And just think, I want you to hold those things in mind as we continue to talk about different strategies and different ideas and principles involved in developing those relationships. So I think more than anything, part of the reason I was asking you to imagine that is because sometimes what we imagine isn't, unfortunately, what comes out. And so it's important to develop a realistic picture of the kids that we're developing relationships with. And as part of that, I wanted just to talk about some typical expected characteristics of youth that can pose real challenges in developing relationships with them. First of all, youth are sensation-seeking. Their brains have been primed by development to take risks and to assign different values to certain risky choices than we do. Because of that, it can lead to a person looking outward into the world and seeking new experiences, taking new risks, which ends up resulting in seeking independence from what they've known before and from the adults and the families in their lives. As they do that, the adolescent brain is developing in such a way that peer interactions and social acceptance are very powerful rewards that result in peers having a much stronger influence, often on behavior in adolescence, than we can have as adults. This draw to social acceptance, which is based on biological changes in the brains and the bodies of adolescents, also results in intense self-involvement. We see this practically as youth often think that basically everything is about them. They can get into thinking that everyone's looking at them, everyone's thinking about them. You can see this if you drop your teenager off at school, the horror they see if someone looks over at the car, because they're constantly thinking that other people are thinking about them and evaluating them constantly. And this is truly driven by the intensity of the emotional social brain getting fired up by peer influence. Speaking of emotions, emotions are easily activated and can overpower the cognitive control areas of the brain that are relatively less developed until later in adolescence and into adulthood than the social-emotional brain. And when the cognitive control issues aren't, or development isn't as strong, there's a decreased likelihood of taking the more rational view of future consequences. And so adolescents are more immediate focused, especially in terms of their rewards. They have limited perspectives because they don't focus necessarily as much on future consequences, especially when there's a large social or emotional influence. But it's not just biology, it's also life experience in terms of the perspectives that a youth can have. As Hassan mentioned, his experiences as a young child are very different from mine were. But what we have to understand is that some of the people that we may be trying to develop a relationship with have a very different belief about their life and about what is expected out of life and about the people in their lives versus other people who may have a totally different idea. And so because of those different perspectives, it's important to, number one, understand those, and number two, know how to continue to develop a relationship with someone who may have very different beliefs than we do. Leading to the final kind of comment, which is youth are not adults. I don't mean to insult anyone's intelligence, but it is so easy, especially in smart, articulate teenager who can seem to understand and rationalize and argue and debate, that they aren't adults. They're still new at relationships. Their brains are still developing, and they're new at making decisions. And for many youth that we work with, their experiences may have been very negative with regard to the adults in their lives. And so as we grow and develop and go out into the world as adults, it's a lot easier for us to understand that there are some people who are very positive for us to interact with, whereas kids just have, by sheer number, many less experiences involving relationships than we do, and that can have a significant impact on how they interact with each other and with us. What is a meaningful relationship? Again, this goes back to the expectations of a relationship. When you were thinking about the relationship that you're developing with a youth, what is it that you expect out of that? What is it you expect out of the youth in that situation? I chose this picture of a library because I love books. I love to read. I love libraries. I love bookstores. That's one of the most meaningful things that I can do in my life is to read and learn from books and escape into those worlds. But I have a story about once going to a bookstore with my son, who was 7 years old at the time, and we were running some errands, and I said I wanted to stop at the bookstore to buy some books. And as we were walking around and I was looking at different books, he picked up one and he said, "Why does anybody like to read? It's not even a sport." And it just was a slap in the face to me because it reminded me that his idea of what's a meaningful activity and what's meaningful in his life was completely different from mine. And I think that that underscores the idea that it's really important to develop a purpose in relationships and understanding what is actually happening, and that the relationship is not just for you, but it's a mutual interaction. So I have a list of things that I think are meaningful components in a relationship, but this is my list. And I don't mean to keep repeating myself, but I would encourage you to make your list of what's meaningful in a relationship, and maybe even compare it to my list, only because, again, what people value in relationships, what people are looking for, may be completely different, and it's so important to know what the other person is expecting and is finding meaningful in the relationship for it to work and to be productive. One last thing I want to say about this is that when I meet with teenagers in my clinical practice, I always ask them about their relationships, but I often ask them what's important in a relationship with another person. And the overwhelmingly number one answer that I get is that teenagers feel like the most important thing in a relationship is that they are there for me when I need them. And so being able to trust someone, to the reliability and the respect, to know that if they truly need someone in the relationship, that person is going to be there. Next word in the title was building. Again, I love the metaphor of the idea of building for no other reason than to really highlight the idea that building relationships has to be a purposeful activity. Relationships don't just happen. Well, they do just happen, but meaningful relationships that can really transform lives take purpose and take planning, and they're not just going to happen. And so if there's one thing that you remember at all from what I say today, I'm hoping that it can be the point that there has to be a purposeful commitment to developing a relationship and to remind yourself that this isn't just going to happen. So that's the vision part. What is it that you want to build? What is it that you want to do through relationships? The capital is the investment of time, the emotional energy, and even the risk, because sometimes we may invest in a relationship that doesn't turn out to be very productive for us. The blueprint, which is to plan, again, the purposeful part. Plan how you're going to do this, especially in the context where you are. I see as people are registering that a lot of people are in different contexts, and so the way that you can build a relationship in a detention center may be very different from the way that you build it in a psychiatric office versus a community setting of a youth center or a probation officer or various kinds. And so part of that part of what I would love for people to think about is what plans in your context can you have to put together a meaningful relationship with kids. The schedule also, I feel like points out the restrictions and the context that you have, how much time you have. Sometimes you have years, sometimes you have an hour with a youth, and so the way that you approach that relationship is going to be different. The crew is so important, to be able to rely on a team of support and to communicate with each other about what your job is. You see in the picture, this guy is working on a roof, but if everybody on the team decided that they're going to do roofing, then the rest of the house wouldn't get built and it would be a disaster. So it's important to communicate with each other about what it is that you're doing in your setting to develop the relationships with youth and with each other. Permits. You have to have permission to have, or openness to have a relationship with someone else. And the way that you do this with teens, teenagers aren't going to necessarily want to develop a relationship with an adult, especially someone in a correctional or a detention center or setting like that. And so it's so important to be able to communicate your goals and your role and your job in that situation so that they are a lot more open and understanding about what it is that you're trying to do. So tools I'm going to move on to that, and using those tools can be very hard work. So the tools or strategies in developing relationships, again, this isn't meant to insult anyone's intelligence at all, but to really, again, provide an outline of things to think about when you're starting to develop a relationship with other youth, with youth. So some of these are very small, some are more important, and sometimes some of these things are going to work with one youth and not with another. But I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly so that we can get to Randy Farmer, and then we'll take questions later, and I'd be happy to talk a little bit more with them. But when you know someone's name, it helps them feel important. It's a sign of respect. Manners matter. It's not only to show that you respect them, but it's a way to teach social skills. It's a way to outline the rules of engagement and expectations in a relationship. Being present and paying attention is perhaps the most important tool of anything in a relationship, because I think it's happening less and less in our world. For example, I'm imagining that some of you listening right now are on your phone or on your computer or are doing other things or multitasking somehow. The fact is that adolescents are very primed to look for nonverbal cues, to really be activated by those social interactions, and often to misinterpret nonverbal cues. And so if you're not present and not paying attention to a youth that you're trying to develop a relationship with, they're going to see that, they're going to know that, and they're going to interpret that in a very negative way, and your work with them is going to be so much harder. Take notice of something special about them. I know this can be hard in a setting that you don't, and it needs to be appropriate, and so you can't necessarily compliment them on their looks, but something about the way they talk or behave or something that they're interested in can help make the connection that much more quickly. Explain your role and communicate your plan. As I said before, adolescents can get really confused and not understand why you're asking them questions, and can honestly get a little bit paranoid. So it's important for them to understand what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. And then to acknowledge their situation. Even say that. I know that you probably have had adults in your life that you don't trust. I'm an adult. You don't know me. But this is what I want to do to help make things better for you. In that process, ask non-threatening questions, things that aren't going to get them too emotional, especially at the beginning. And get them to teach you something about what they do, one of their interests, which will help you find something to praise, help develop some kind of interaction such that laughter or some positive emotions can come out of that. And use yourself. Tell stories about maybe some of your own interests within reason and within appropriate bounds. Because, again, relationships aren't necessarily one-sided. And so when the youth can start seeing you as a person that they want to be connected with and want to be like, then so much of the work is already done. It's so important once you've done that with someone to try to remember that and the next time you see them or interact with them, to bring that up, even if it's just one thing that you can mention to them or ask them about, because youth tend to be so self-centered and really focus on what other people are thinking about them, it really goes a long way in terms of helping them feel like you were paying attention, you understand them, and that you'll be there for them. Be consistent, monitor your own feelings and thoughts, get support from your team, which really helps being able to monitor your own feelings and thoughts. And finally, I've used the word appropriate. I think it's so important to have your own relationships and commit to your own relationships outside of your work, because you can't get your emotional needs met through working with youth. That has to come from your partner, from your families, from your friends, to make you stronger and to be able to have the emotional stability and the commitment and the energy to engage with youth that can be very difficult, because they're always watching you. And as was alluded to before, it's not necessarily what you say that's going to have the greatest impact. It's what you do, it's who you are, and they are watching you. Thank you so much for this time, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from Randy and Hassan.
Thank you, Rodney. Our next presenter is Randall Farmer. Mr. Farmer is currently in his 9th year as Educational Director of the Lincoln Public Schools Pathfinder Education Program in the Lancaster County Youth Service Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. He has been an educator of youth at risk for 25 years in a variety of settings, such as a psychiatric hospital, an alternative school, an inner-city school, and juvenile justice facilities. Randy, it is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here today. I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to participate in this webinar with Hassan and with Rodney. This is such an important topic, and I'm pleased to see that there are so many people in attendance today. Relationships is something that's been discussed for a long time, but I think we're really in a revolutionary time here where there are certainly some new ideas and new information we all need to hear. I want to thank all the attendees for the work that they do with youth every day, and for taking time out of their day today to be here. I intend to provide you with some content for dialogue with your colleagues. I hope that you take the information that I can present to you here today, look at it as a large painting, and see what parts of that picture will apply to you and your work on relationships with youth. There are lots of types of relationships out there, and I've been asked to talk about relationships in an educational setting today. The educational setting is certainly unique in that we are challenging young people with content. We are challenging them to win and to struggle in an academic setting. But I think everyone serves as a teacher in one way or another. But the key part about educators is that they're doing this day in and day out. And they've continued to grow and develop their training as their years go on and they gain experience. And so it's a very unique setting, but I think it applies to everybody. And I think the types of skills that we're going to talk about will apply to anyone's relationships with youth. So quality education is really an interaction. It's not just instruction. You always hear education talked about as classroom instruction. But in reality, if you don't have the relationship, you don't have the ability to instruct, and you don't have the ability to help young people learn. So it certainly is the first key component. And sometimes in the world of testing scores and pressure for graduation rates and all of the other aspects of education that have started to dominate our world, we don't always remember how important the relationship is, and we don't always, most importantly, take the time. And you're going to hear me talk about that more later. But one of the key parts about an educational relationship is that we're not on an island, that we are certainly affected by the environment and the culture that surrounds us. And there are many, many aspects to that. If you're looking at education specifically within a juvenile justice facility, the preparation of these young people before they come to the school area or to the classroom, the physical environment that they walk into as a school. These are key parts in how that day is going to begin, how that young person is going to view that relationship before they ever have a conversation with you. And so I can't stress enough how key those pieces are to getting the educational relationship off to a good start. A good breakfast, a cheerful face to wake them up in the morning, walking into or coming out of a clean and exciting, colorful environment makes all the difference in the world. The interactions with non-educators, you know, whoever else they run into before they get to the teacher is going to impact on that relationship that's going to happen in the educational setting. And this is true for any relationship with a young person. It's all those people that surround them. But are their physical and emotional needs being met? And is there a pro-school culture that just surrounds them all the time? It's actually a big aspect of something that we've promoted here is developing a positive atmosphere around every moment in the classroom, in the school area. So key to the discussion, key to the things I'm going to say today, and if you want to just remember one thing you hear all day from me, it's that the little things really matter. They truly, truly matter. As much as we'd like to have a 1, 2, 3-step process for here's how you build a relationship, things like the clarity of your message, the intent of your message, what you assumed about the student or otherwise, those all are going to play a part. Do you have a positive perception of that youth, regardless of whether you like them, whether you get along with them, whether you appreciate what they've done or who they are? They have to know you have a positive perception, a positive intent. And you have to send that message clearly and consistently, and take the time to do it. I know over here I'm saying it for a second time already. Time isn't time lost. Time is gaining you the opportunity to do the types of things you want to do with the rest of the relationship. If you take the time to understand the student, to do all these things that Rodney was just talking about, to develop that understanding, then when it comes to the educational setting, you'll be able to be successful. It is in the details, all of the details and every little piece and part, the little things, they are what matter. I wish there was a quick fix, a simple answer, one easy solution, but all of the youth are unique, so it's going to be different in each situation. Their needs are unique. The solutions to help them have a positive educational experience to build that relationship are unique, and the details matter. It's a matter of getting the little details right at the right time, but as Rodney was saying, we are the adults. It's our responsibility. The young people are going to do what they're going to do in the relationship. They're supposed to make mistakes, and we're supposed to help them learn. So let's look at some of the ideas that are out there. In the NPJS NIC revision of the desktop guide to juvenile services, there's some really good information, and that's available on the NPJS website. It's the desktop guide to quality practice for working with youth in confinement. And there's some key points in there, and I pulled those out for you. Common positive regard for education. And that's a rallying point for everyone in your facility or everyone who's going to surround the educational program, is constantly emitting a common positive regard. Kids need to hear that education matters. We're already talking to elementary students about high school graduation and where they're going to college in the education world today. And so every youth that we run across should be hearing those same messages. When are you going to graduate? What are you going to do in college? And make it look real. A facility has to see education as a valued as a valued priority. There have to be shared information and shared responsibility for making the education program function. Sharing information about students on a consistent and timely basis. Understanding what each person's role is in that education setting. It is a shared responsibility. One of the ways that education can help make youth safer within facilities is by keeping them engaged. And I say this all the time to groups that I speak to. An engaged youth is not going to cause a problem. They're going to be involved in positive things, and they won't have the time or energy to do any negative things. Another area that I have found, and an area I've adopted as one of my particular areas of interest lately, is language. Now, there's some basic stuff out there that everybody knows about word choice and volume and tone, but we don't often work it as a craft. And I've been working with educators on this lately as a really, really key piece. And there's so much to language and how it develops in a relationship and how the student or young person will respond. There are physical traits such as your body language, which on a basic level we all understand how close you get, whether you lean in, whether you're nodding at a young person. But there's also a genuineness, a real sense of caring that can be conveyed in your body language, or a real sense of safety by providing space to someone who isn't comfortable. Eye contact, we've heard things about eye contact and those sorts of things before, but the appropriate use of that is really unique to sometimes the cultural background of the young person that you're working with. It's an area definitely worth paying attention to. These physical traits, they're like a dance. If you can think about it like dancing with a partner, and if you're reading the signals from that other person, it will allow you to make the best decisions about what works and what doesn't. Verbal traits, when you're talking, your inflection, your tone, your pace, your volume, that's like conducting an orchestra. You'd be amazed how easily you can hold a young person's attention just by changing the way you're talking, but also by listening to them and not interrupting, and using words that confirm your listening, summarizing back to them something that you heard them say, acknowledging what they saw or felt or said, keeping your responses really short and clear. Listen first, ask first, then you speak to the young person. Avoiding things like I know and this happened to me. And when you are really careful with your vocabulary, you'll find that young people understand you much better. There's an entire webinar out there that should be available on adolescent vocabulary and the issues surrounding that. They really don't always hear because they don't understand the words. Second part, or one of the key parts, is also sincerely consider how they could be right, or at least at the bare minimum, how they arrived at the thought or idea that they got to. Of course, you never want to pick up on the power struggle that they're trying to throw out there, but with your conversation, you need to get in there, get what you can get, do what you can do for that young person, but make it about them, not about you getting what you needed out of the conversation, not what you needed as a solution. Just recognize what they have available. You also, in language, have to be aware of the language going on in your own mind, about your own thought processes. Do you speak and think about a student like their parent is listening to every word that you say? Because that's what we need to do. It's not okay because you think you know, oh, well, I shouldn't say those things about a young person, or I shouldn't vent those things about a young person, or I was only joking about that young person. Because those words, every time they go through your mind, every time they come out of your mouth, even in jest or in the privacy of a different room with only adults, they influence the relationship. They influence the way you see that young person and other young people. And whether you're kidding or not, it will influence the way others begin to think about children. And if you think about, is that my child? Would I want to hear that phrase about my child? That's a pretty serious responsibility. And the last one is honesty. It's when you're trying to bring a young person bad news or consequences or let them know they haven't been successful, or even sometimes when you have to tell a young person it isn't fair, because sometimes things aren't fair. That's when it's hard to find the honesty, the straightforwardness, and the right words said in the right way that the young person hears them, and hears them with a sense that someone cares about them. There's a little bulletin out there, and it came from the Wise Brain organization, wisebrain.org. They put out a bulletin, and they had an article called Mindful Conversations, The Path to Great Relationships. It was by Daniel Ellenberg and Judith Bell. And the focus was on resolving conversations that hadn't gone well, but in reality they offered a nice set of 5-step process for looking at how to focus on a relationship. That's the way I took what they put in this information, and it's about what you need to do yourself. Some of this overlaps a little bit with what Rodney said, but you need to be aware. You need to know yourself, know your own image, thoughts, feelings, and understand your role in the relationship with a young person. And teachers and educators have to really keep that in mind, because things that go on in your life influence what you're thinking about yourself, which influences your relationship. You have to be intentional. Focus your mind on the moment in the relationship. You know, oftentimes when we're educators, we're working with young people, there's 1,000 other things, the next lesson plan, the attendance you had to take, the paperwork you need to do, the other student waiting for help with whatever they're doing. But you've got to be intentional and not distracted, and keep focused on that particular relationship at that moment. And being compassionate. You know, it's a simple thing, and we've all heard it, but if you reflect on it for a moment, that empathy to connect with others, that understanding their feelings that are part of their humanity, you know, compassion is free. It doesn't cost you anything to stand in that other person's shoes for a little bit. It helps you build relationships, and you genuinely can begin to get an understanding. When you're dealing with young people, that's so hard to do because their world can be so different from the world that we grew up in. And so when we say, well, they ought to know, and when I was a kid, those things don't apply to young people today. It is a very different world. And be authentic. Be who you are. The young people see through the facade every time. And if you're genuine, they respect that. And be curious. That's one of the most powerful tools that you have in developing relationships, educationally or any other way. Eager to learn about that other person. And suspend the idea that you've heard this story before, that, yeah, I know what this kid's about because I've seen 100 of them before in my career. Because they are not all the same, and every time they will surprise you. They also presented in that same article an acronym called SCHEMA for self, co-creation, hopes, empathy, mental maps, and action plans. And it's a nice reflection on the types of things that you need to do during the relationship, including yourself, understanding how you and the other person create the relationship together, bringing hope into the relationship, having empathy, which we've touched on before, and then creating a map of how that relationship will be successful with markers along the way that you're paying attention to in that relationship, and some specific action plan steps that will help you get to where you want that relationship to go. It's a nice breakdown of 5 steps to get to a positive relationships with youth and in an educational setting. So I give you a couple of those little tools because I like those kinds of things and I think they're helpful for people, but there really is a grassroots education, relationship building thought process that I typically use myself. I tend to be a down-to-earth guy. A welcoming environment, an environment where people are culturally aware of each other and each other's needs, and that is an ongoing continual learning process for everyone. A setting that offers young people options and different ways when whatever the current situation is isn't working. A place where they are accepted and where they're supported and where they know it's safe to make mistakes. Where we are looking for small changes and expecting the setbacks, because inevitably our young people have setbacks. That's part of being a young person. They're supposed to make mistakes. It's our job as adults to be there and support them. If you haven't been paying attention to the latest adolescent brain development research, and it's coming out literally monthly, that is a critical area. There's no more powerful place right now in research, in my opinion, than understanding more and more about the physiology, the brain structure, and the brain development that goes on and is behind our students' behaviors and relationships. Understand their academic background, and look at the time and the place for difficult academics, for challenging academics, or for easy academics. Sometimes there's the right time and the right place in a relationship for all 3 of those. The last one is assessments and feedback. We can't give young people enough feedback. I think That's part of where their struggle is today in a lot of relationships, is they're not getting the honest and the genuine feedback. Clear and predictable routines, taking the time to understand pathways for young people to express themselves, and engaging materials. Those are all critical to any functional education program. Many of those things I'm sure you've heard before, and there is time, taking the time once again. And I'm using up more than my time, but that's okay. High quality educational content, high interest content, detailed, prepared, and organized. Young people know whether the education that they're receiving has been prepared adequately, and that adds value to it and to the relationship. And builds passion. We have to build passion in young people for education. Not about grades, not about graduation, not about meeting requirements for a parent or a court requirement, but because they love to learn. There's nothing more powerful we can do for a young person than build a passion for wanting to learn. The last quick little piece here is transition. I have to talk about when those young people transition out of our classrooms or out of our facilities. The relationship there is critical. That's a crossover moment. And we should start talking about that from the moment we meet a young person we know is transitioning out at some point, so they see hope, so they know their support, so that they feel safety while they're there and know that it's safe for them to move on, and that relationship we've started can have a continuation, can have a process that carries them forward into wherever they're headed. So you can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. And if we can make our relationships educationally playful and caring and a place that kids want to be, then we've been successful. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share what I had to say today, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you, Randy. Good job. It's a shame that the three of you really don't like to talk much. Now, for some final observations, we're going to go back to Hassan Davis.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Randy and Rodney. I hope that you all are really enjoying this and taking in the way we've provided this to you. I want to share, as we close out and get some questions, just a little bit more about how I understand this. The question that keeps coming to mind as we listen to all of the data and information about the brain research, about educational environments, all the things that we're learning and we know, the question of how do we operationalize it always comes up. For me personally, that was a challenge in my growing up. I want to tell you really quickly about my hope dealers. My mother, Alice Lovelace, and my father, Charles Jicky Raleigh, and Dr. Lorraine Wilson. When I was 11 years old, I got my first arrest, and as you all might imagine, it was a lot of contention. There were 6 of us who were involved, and it was a high-stress, high-drama day. But instead of getting the response that I expected, that many of you all probably received from parents who are all come in angry and loud at the system, but most often what we know is that they're afraid and they're concerned, but it all comes out as anger. And so waiting for my mother to arrive, I was preparing myself for the worst and was surprised and maybe confused on the long ride home in the silence of the car when I finally found the courage to look up at her, and she was just crying these huge silent tears. And she looked down at me and she said, "Baby, if you could see what I see every time that I look at you, you would know how great you were." Now, that was a moment of decision-making for her as an adult relationship builder. She could go to form and react in stereotypical ways that immediately create the separation and the desire for a young person to justify his choice-making. But she chose instead to build, to show, project forward what the possibility was and set an expectation. When I started alternative school, Dr. Lorraine Wilson called me to her office once, and I was expecting that talk you get when you're the kid like me, like so many of the young people you all serve, that, you know, I know who you are and I'm waiting to get you out of my school. So I'm always like, we can probably get that done by lunch because I know what has to be said and who I need to hit. But instead, Dr. Lorraine Wilson sat me down And she said, I think you can accomplish anything you set your mind to, and all you can do is make me a fool for believing such things. And it was a pivotal moment, as Randy said, as an educator for a young person who had never had educational success, to be told, in spite of dyslexia, in spite of ADHD, in spite of a series of being removed from 5 different elementary schools, that there was already greatness, and the only thing you had to do was keep it. And so that trust forward model for us as hope dealers, as youth builders, is important. We can't be the ones reserving our best judgment, our best thinking about young people until they earn it, because these are the young people who need us to give it forward so that they can believe they deserve it. And so for me, those became very pivotal moments. I want to share very quickly in just a couple minutes the 5 strategies that I share very often for adult hope dealers who are building positive relationships with young people. Avoid insanity, act with faith and hope, allow time, forgive failure, and deserve victory. And insanity principle is simple. We all know it. If we don't know it, we've lived it. You keep doing what you've been doing, you keep getting what you've been getting. Strangely enough, in the systems that we work in, and I know that I'm not alone in believing this, we have been doing some things consistently and repetitively over the last 20 years or so, and we have not received a different result. And every day we wander back into those systems and we try again with our fingers crossed, hoping that today we might get something different. And so again, going back to the initial conversation, this is about being intentionally engaged in seeking difference. If you have an expectation, an outcome at the beginning, and you've heard all presenters talk about this, then it allows you actually to scaffold your work with a young person to build toward that. And John Maxwell even said it better. If you keep doing what you've always done, your competition gets better, you get worse results. And what's our competition? Our competition is gang involvement. Our competition is teen pregnancy. Our competition is high school dropouts. Our competition are young people who lose their potential and their possibility and become a drain instead of a benefit to our systems across the board. We cannot afford that. So even those young people who fall in crisis, we have to figure out how we pick them and raise them back up in possibility. Faith is important. It is the belief in something unseen. And every child deserves somebody like you who can see them as they can't even possibly imagine themselves, because you painting that picture, like my mother and Dr. Lorraine Wilson painted that picture, allows a young person to see, even just imagine in glimpses, what might be, and it might even give them the courage to reach for it. And as hope dealers, you actually have to believe what you're selling. I don't know how many times I've encountered folks who talk about the work that they do for young people, but in the same breath talk about the fact that those kids, and you heard me with the air quotes, those kids are never going to be anything. You can't hold 2 minds and get to one purpose. So if either you believe that the work you do is the most important and most valuable work you could do to transform a child, or you don't. And if you don't, here's the kicker. You need to get off the call. It's time for you to do something else, because we got work to do here. But if you do believe, you have to hold that in your head and heart in order to get to the results we're trying to get to. And time is so important. You heard Randy talk about it. You heard Rodney talk about it. The time is the element that we've lost with all of the technology, the belief that everything ought to be fixed right now because I identified the problem right now. And so we have to be patient. Einstein once said that time is what we have so that everything doesn't happen at once. And we have to keep that in mind and realize that this is incremental success, incremental building that we're trying to do to transform maybe a whole lifetime of negative connecting and negative relationships. So be mindful of that and be patient with it. I have lots of folks who have asked me over the years, when is it okay to finally give up? How many times do I have to pick up a young person or tell somebody they're great and they continue to mess up and stay there? How long do I have to stay in this? And I used to say, we should keep doing this until, we would think it's okay for someone to give up on us. And I realized that we, especially the folks that do this work, are pretty quick to say, well, yeah, somebody should have probably gave up on me years ago. And so then I started saying maybe we ought to put the standard at when we think it's okay for someone to give up on our child if they were in this situation. And to my surprise, I found that lots of us are willing to look at our kids and go, yeah, some of them you just got to lose. And so I finally came up with this idea that building relationships with young people is like wrestling an 800-pound alligator. And the best advice I've ever given anybody for wrestling an 800-pound alligator is that you don't give up when you get tired. You give up when the alligator gets tired. And the thing we have to understand, folks, is this alligator ain't tired. And so we have to figure out how we dig a little deeper. If we are committed to the outcome, then we stay in the fight until we get the result we came for, not the result that somebody else thinks is acceptable. That's the only standard. We have to forgive failure, ours and theirs. Very often, I saw some questions coming through the feed about what happens with those young people who do incomprehensible things that are, we have to still be able to see a basic set of human characteristics and humanity in the folks we serve, or we can't serve them. But we have to forgive them and see them as folks that we're trying to move forward. But we have to forgive ourselves too. We very often, I don't know about you, but I've got lots of things in my own experience of where I was doing my best work for young people and it wasn't the right work. And in some of those instances, I wanted to walk away because, I felt that maybe I wasn't useful. I had to finally forgive myself and allow myself to be as human as the people I want to serve and give myself permission to let that go and promise never to make that mistake again and get back into the fight. We can't afford to lose more of you who want to do this and who are the right folks to do this work well. And so we have to forgive our failures and give ourselves permission to go back in and do our next best work for that child that maybe we lost it on or we didn't quite have a grasp on the family situation well. So forgiving failure is very important. Deserve victory. I love this. This poster I found, it was a World War II poster with Winston Churchill. And when Great Britain was being assaulted by the Nazi war machine during World War II, Hitler gave a clear mandate to all of Europe. You roll over, you show your belly, you let us become the ones in charge, and we'll let you keep all of your things. But if you stand up against us, we will destroy everything, and history will never know you were here. And so this little island of Britain decided to stand up and to fight that great war machine. And Winston Churchill said that every man, every woman, and child will fight. And when we fight, we will most likely die, but everyone watching will know that we deserved victory. Now, I want you to understand, he didn't say be victorious. He didn't say win every battle. He said deserve victory. That's the standard that we hold ourselves to in the work we do. You engage every child with your best intent, hoping that it's enough. And when it's not, if you know you did everything you could, even when you don't get the result you want, you have the courage to go back in the next child, the next time, and do your best again. And so hold that standard in your head and heart as we move forward. You play multiple roles, whether you're an educator, a youth care worker, a counselor, a psychiatrist, someone who does recreational programming. All of you carry all of these roles, and you are the example, maybe the only example, of what might be a positive relationship for a young person. And taking the opportunity to own and acknowledge that and value it for what it is really important moving forward. And so we have to continue to keep that at front of mind. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once said that if you treat a man as he is, he'll remain as he is. And if you treat a man as he can and should be, he will become as he can and should be. What we're asking you to do is to look at these young people through the lens of possibility, not through the lens of present circumstance. To see them as they might be with your support and with your guidance and with the ability to see, like you do, a greater future, a better possibility, a more positive outcome. Without that vision from you, many of them will never have the opportunity to raise their head or eyes high enough to see anything better than they've already seen. And I'm not saying this because I saw the Oprah Winfrey Dr. Phil 2-hour special or I found one of those nice magazines. I'm saying this because I know it. More than I know anything in my lived life, you don't go from a life expectancy of 15 years. You don't go from banging on the streets of Atlanta, Georgia to Commissioner of Juvenile Justice accidentally. You don't go from expelled from every school to graduate of law school accidentally. You don't go from public enemy number 1 to testifying before Congress on juvenile justice reauthorization accidentally. You get there because somebody believed enough in you to stay in the fight long enough for you to find your own strength to keep on going. This is the work, folks. This is the most important job that I've ever done, and I hope that you believe it's the most important work that you can ever do. If you do, that means that you are indeed a hope dealer. And I want to welcome you to the club, and I want to thank you so much for your important work. I want to leave you with this quote that I think sums up what we have to do to keep moving and to being successful in this great work. With that, I will close. Thank you so much for being here and your great opportunity to be a part of it.
I want to thank all of our presenters today for just a wealth of information. I think we could have gone on easily for another hour before we even got to the question and answer portion, but that's where we are. We have a lot of questions that you put in our queue. We will try to address as many of those as possible in the time that we have left. And Randy, I'll come to you to kick it off, but Hassan and Rodney, you certainly can chime in. One of the questions was, please address the issue of relationship building and working with youth in a professional way, and also addressing the challenge of maintaining appropriate boundaries while still being honest.
Well, thank you, Michael. That's a great question. The challenge of maintaining appropriate boundaries while still being honest is one that we face every day because there are so many different types of youth. There are youth who can really challenge you. There are youth who become very attached to you. There are youth that are very unpredictable. But I think half of the answer to the question is how you've presented yourself prior to that situation. If the youth see you as a role model, as a professional, and as someone who has a tremendous amount of caring and concern for them and their well-being, the professional boundary almost builds itself. And then it's a matter of the practical things of how you position yourself with a young person, the words that you use with them. But the being honest part is probably the hardest part, because finding those right words to say difficult things is a challenge. But if we remember that we're the adult in the situation, if we remember that we are there strictly to help them, and that can be done in a compassionate, caring way, but there has to be a real boundary there. Hassan, Rodney, is there something you'd want to add to that?
I think so much of what, this is Rodney, so much of what makes it easier to be honest is going back to what I said before about staying present and attentive. And so it's okay to be honest about what you're thinking and feeling at that very moment that youth is challenging you or making you feel sad or bringing back memories to you. To say things that enable you both to connect with them, but also to let them know that you understand them. And there are, I wish that there were a better, sort of more concrete answer, because I think that there are some kids that you may want to share a little bit more, for example, about your life experience. Whereas other kids, you wouldn't want to do that because you know that that could either traumatize them in some way, or they could use that against you to manipulate you in a different way. And so I hate to keep repeating myself, but I think it's just really important to stay aware, to be attentive, and to stay present. And I think that most of us, can rely on our feelings and intuition to know that if you're feeling manipulated, you probably are being manipulated. And to broaden it up, the answer up a little bit, the purposeful, intentional part of these relationships is that I saw another question that kind of reminded me of this, is that if there are certain kids who have done really bad things, and certain kids who have learned through the course of their lives or because of who they are to be very manipulative and who can be dangerous in that way. And I think you can still have a very positive, meaningful relationship with them if you're aware that that's what's happening, if you can lay it out and be honest about the fact that you know that's what's happening. And then again, sort of always go back to your goals and your blueprint about what it is that you want from that relationship. And not just what you want, but how you want to see that relationship challenging and growing and developing this youth that's in your care at the time. I hope that's a little bit helpful.
You know, there's one other thing I thought of, that there's a little grassroots technique that I use a lot, the long pause. If you're not sure, if you're not comfortable, if something doesn't feel quite right, take the time for a long pause, take the time to think it through. There's nothing wrong with that open air space for a minute. And if need be, find a way to put it off for a later time. Say, I'm sorry, I need to leave for just a minute, or I'm not sure how to handle that, and I need to think about this for a minute, or I'm not comfortable with that. You know, that's as honest can be.
Thank you. Let's get to the next question. Hassan, I'll come to you with this one. When you have a child that has trust problems, how do you get them to open up when you've tried all sorts of things to work with them?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the first thing I say is go back to the alligator, right? That is the alligator. And for young people in crisis, especially with trust issues and who have had difficult or terrible adult-child relationships, trust is going to be a huge barrier to overcome. And I think that the intentional, meaningful, developmental part of relationship building is for young people to know that you're there, period. And so continue to show, continue to let them know and encourage them, and then wait for them. And every time there's an opportunity, let them know that you're still there, because I think that consistency is also an important variable. Many young people, have been in experiences where an adult has been in their life and seemed like a great person, and they disappear. With many of us, many of you, you show up every day, every week, and so that consistency will eventually create a sense of relationship that allows you maybe to go deeper. But you have to stay engaged and continue to let them know that when they're ready, you'll be ready, and go from there.
Is there ever a time in the relationship building process where you would involve the parent?
The first day? And that I appreciate that. One of the things that I know we didn't get to directly, but I think is important for us to say very clearly, is that trying to, and air quotes again, fix a child or make a young person better without engaging their family in that process is not going to happen. What we know from the data is that most young people return, no matter how broken the family, return to that family unit. So if we're not working to develop the same skills, the same opportunity in the family unit, so that when they leave our care, they go into a place that at least has the skills to manage with them, we're not going to be able to be successful. And so the family ought to be more involved. In fact, in Kentucky, we did some great work in family engagement, and I hope they continue to do that work. Really looking at how we build a system that has the family engaged as a support, as a team member, in success for that young person at the beginning and throughout the process. And if we don't have that, I don't think we can claim meaningful success with the transformation of young people's lives. What about you other guys?
It's also so important to understand those dynamics from the very beginning, because the way that we develop as infants, from infancy up until especially in our teenage years, is that all relationships have patterns, and we learn very quickly to interact with certain people in certain ways, and everybody takes on a role in the family, and everybody plays that role very well. And so when a youth is sitting in front of us, they're very likely to engage with us in the same way that they would engage with any other adult, in particular parents. Not exactly, but there are certain psychological dynamics and certain expectations that they have from the adult who's sitting in front of them. And so involving the family and being able to understand that history and those dynamics can really be so powerful to either challenge them or to acknowledge them or to work with them in teaching all of us, really, how to figure out a way, in particular, specifically for this youth, to use his experiences, to use the way that he interacts in the world, hopefully for good, but hopefully to give him a different perspective on the fact that you don't have to be yelled at by every adult in your life, or you don't have to lie to me in the way that you have to lie to your parents or your teachers or the cops or anybody else. And to give them a way to practice and develop a new way of relating with their families, with other adults, with their peers, with the world.
I would agree completely with what Hassan and Rodney both said. The parent can be an amazing resource for helping you learn the things you need to know to develop a relationship with a young person. I think another key piece is that sometimes we just aren't going to be the person that can develop that relationship with a young person. You can maybe develop a functional relationship, but we can't be the answer to every child, and we need to be accepting of that and recognize that maybe the best help we can provide is to help them find another person they can build that relationship with.
Well said.
Rodney, I'm coming back to you with this next question.
Okay.
What is the most effective strategy for addressing emotional trauma from early childhood?
Well, that's such a important question, obviously, and such a complicated question. And I think that so many of the questions that have been asked sort of get at that issue in different ways. I think the first thing I want to say is that it's not our job to necessarily uncover emotional trauma, and certainly not our job to fix it. I think that kind of work has to happen in a very structured therapeutic setting with someone who is trained in working and supporting people in that setting. Again, I want to underscore the importance of involving family in that, both to understand the history, both genetic and social history of a family and the role that trauma has played in the lives of that family, but also to understand what that youth has been through. I know that probably most of the people on this webinar are not therapists or psychiatrists or necessarily trained in mental health issues. And so that being said, I feel like the number one thing we can all do is to learn more about trauma, to learn the way that it affects people, to understand that people who have been traumatized will react to you in ways that you may not understand. And when that happens, it could be because they are being re-traumatized or triggered or just simply exhibiting ways that they've learned how to survive. And when that's happening, it can be very helpful to acknowledge that that's happening, to acknowledge that whatever's going on between the two of you, you don't understand, and it is probably related to something that may have happened in the past, but that this is a different situation, again, staying present, and that you're going to be there for them and do your best to protect them and not hurt them. I hope that that's helpful. And again, I feel like I just want to make one more kind of reminder that it's very complex and complicated work, and it's something that has to be approached very carefully and with training and with a lot of support, because a lot of us have experienced trauma in our lives, and the youth that we work with can trigger us as well, and that could be a very negative dynamic that can start going as well. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. The next question, and all three of you can chime in. What are your favorite rapport or trust-building activities when working with youth? And Hassan, maybe you could even address that even at a higher level and working with gang-involved youth.
Sure. Well, I'll take a shot at it. I think that for me and my background prior to my work in justice and education was as a teaching artist, a residence artist, and so I use a lot of creative writing and engagement exercises to draw young people in conversation. And I think especially with relationship building, the ability to focus on them. There's an exercise that I've trained at a number of MPJS conferences and another number of national conferences about setting ground rules and allowing young people to be the ones that set those ground rules and developing a rapport through some writing exercises. So I think that there are tools out there that allow us to get to the relationship building, even with those very difficult, and I've had some very difficult audiences. But a big piece of it is finally giving young people a voice so that they can speak to their past drama, trauma, and pain, as Rodney might look at it, so that then they can actually find a voice to speak to their future hope. And if we don't look back and examine that deep enough, we can't build a relationship or the structure and the support for a relationship that will allow us to get to those difficult conversations, especially with those young people deeply involved in negative social relationships, gangs, and other types of behavior. But I think there's some great stuff out there. No quick fixes. Trust me, there's no quick fixes. But it's about that steady commitment and finding ways to ask them, sometimes very clearly, ask them what it is they need in order to be different, to do different, and then figure out how you scaffold that to scale.
Rodney or Randy, any other comments before we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I agree with everything Hassan just said, is that you just have to be a presence there that allows them to open up and begin to engage in the relationship with you. And sometimes that's just being around so they learn who you are, and then that leads to maybe engaged in a common positive activity, and then the conversation. But the conversation isn't about you. It's about them and what they're willing to share. And I think if you take those steps, just exactly like what Hassan was saying, that's what leads to success.
So with all the hard work that folks undertake in building a positive relationship with a young person while they might be in custody, how do you bridge that when they're released back into a negative environment or a negative relationship? How do you address that? Or do you?
I think that can be one of the most challenging issues to deal with from an emotional point of view, is to really work hard and invest in a relationship and invest in a youth, knowing that they're going to go back to an environment that may be very traumatizing or very difficult for them to manage. And in some cases, we can easily predict that they're going to go right back to behaviors that brought them to us in the first place. And that can be really hard to know and to see coming. But going back to Hassan's alligator analogy, I think that, in Hassan's life itself, sometimes kids will surprise us in terms of the things they take away from us. And all that we can do is equip them with the tools that they feel like are going to be helpful for them and that we know will be helpful for them, again, to engage their family and communities in hoping that we can bring about some kind of transformation in the place where they're returning to, and then continue to let them know that even if I never see you again, I will remember you, I will remember what this relationship was about, and I have hope that you will be successful and you will have a happy, fulfilling, meaningful life. And give them that hope so that if nothing else, that's somewhere in the back of their mind that they can remember that the next time they're walking past the drug dealer on the street corner.
Okay.
I agree.
I hate to have to wrap this up. I think I can squeeze in one more question here. And Randy, I'll come to you. How do you encourage education to a youth whose family does not view education as being important? How do you bring the child and the family on board to see the importance of education?
You know, that's a great question, and that is an all too common problem. But I think that's where inspiring young people to want to learn, to motivating their curiosity, to make them realize that learning is not something that is finished at high school or finished in college or finished with a doctorate, that you're going to do this your entire life. It's what life is all about, is learning and experiencing new things. And so if you can fire that kind of a drive up in a young person, then past experience doesn't come into play as often. And I think it's a really critical missing piece in a lot of education today, is that we're too focused on, you know, it's the diploma, it's the grade, it's the back to school, rather than it's, hey, life is about an amazing array of interests and activities, and every one of them is available to you. So that would be my best advice. But also the challenge of being the first in the family is not a bad direction to take the conversation either.
And after that, I think that's a great answer, Andy. One of the things that I noticed working with not just youth but family who are, you know, education adverse, is that once you can start to actually connect that education to their dream building, right? What we know about young people is that there's a lot of future thinking going on internally. When we ask those questions about who it is you imagine yourself in 5 years or 10 years, once we can get them to commit, even vaguely to something, we can actually start to backcast from that vision to themselves. When I ask that question of parents, I've not met a parent in crisis, in challenge, with a difficult child who has not had some great vision for what they want their child to be. And if you can get that out there and then ask them, you know, enlist them as partners in helping build that possibility, I think you start to create the opportunity for buy-in. But again, that's another relationship tool. That's another role modeling for the young person of how you engage and draw folks in, despite whatever challenges they have, you know, to be partners in this dream building together.
Well, we've still got over 260 people signed in listening to all of the great information that you're sharing. So let's just go with one more question here. We go across the board with all three of you. So at least give one or two ideas or tips. What are some tips for getting started with a youth who really doesn't want to interact with you?
I would say the first thing is talking about them, asking them some question that they'll be willing to answer. And that could be, where did you go to school last? That could be, you know, did you have a favorite person in your old school? That could be, did you see this basketball game last night? It could be anything to get the door open.
Yeah, I think open-ended questions are good. You know, again, going back to the idea of that future self, getting young people to talk about who they imagine themselves, especially versus who they are in the present, and being able to get out of the reality of where they are, which is the thing that's got them shut up and sitting in the corner, to who do you imagine yourself to be. It might get some crazy answers out there to give you a chance to really start to draw things out of them. But I think those questions, like Randy said, are important, and giving them open-ended questions so you don't get the yes, no, 12 answers that used to frustrate me so much.
And I think it's important to really try to think about, when this happens with me, I try to think about what it is that's causing this kid to not want to interact with me. And it's a great chance, I feel like, to be yourself and to be honest, and also to just throw out some lines and see if they bite, such as sometimes I say, you know, I'm really sorry that you have to come to see me as well. I think if I were you, I wouldn't want to come talk to me either, because I'm an old guy sitting in an office. Like I wouldn't want to do that either if I were a teenager. Where would you rather be? What would you rather be doing right now? And you know, I totally agree with what Randy and Hassan have said, that to get them focused on themselves and being able to talk about themselves in a way that you can then grab hold of them and draw information out and identify with them, can open the door. Sometimes they're just not going to. And to be able to acknowledge that and to say, I get it, you don't want to talk with me, I'm here, I'd love to talk with you, I'm open, but sometimes I don't feel like talking to, so let's take a break and try it again another time.
Well, I think, unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap things up here. They're going to make me pay. I know each of you, both as professionals, you're each awesome in your own right, but you're even better people, and I appreciate your time, your passion, and your involvement in today's broadcast. So I want to thank everyone again for participating. If we could please take a few minutes to complete the online survey that pops up at the end. This webinar will be archived on OJJDP's online university, I think within 15 business days. For more information on anything that you've seen or heard today, please feel free to contact any of our respective offices. We'll be glad to follow up with you. I want to personally thank the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for their support of today's broadcast. Please watch for future announcements about upcoming webinars. Until then, I'm Michael Jones. Good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Go wrestle some alligators.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.